Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I'm frequently asked my advice on planes. I'm just going to give you my opinion today, and it's surrounding the low-angle jack. Now, Stanley originally made this. It was called the number 62, and there are stories that it was used primarily for surfacing butcher blocks and designed low angle for the purpose of cutting end grain. I don't buy all of that. I'm not saying that's not what it was used for, but I think if you compare it to the traditional bench plane, there's not that much of a difference, and I'll build you my case. So there's, I think, 3 different companies that now make a version of this. I'm very familiar with it because the company I represented before. This is the Wood River version. This is the Stanley Bedrock number 5.5, and this is the Wood River modern version of the Stanley Bedrock 5.5. Now you'll notice that this one is not as wide. The 5.5 up until 1939 had a 2 1/4 inch blade, and by the time Stanley switched to a 2 3/8 inch blade, they were no longer doing the Bedrock. So you can't find a Bedrock 5.5 in 2 3/8. So when Wood River made theirs, took all the features from the original Bedrock, 2 3/8 inch wide blade, thicker blade, and a great plane, also made out of superior materials. But I'm going to set this one aside. We're going to talk primarily about these two and the difference. First big difference that matters to me, I like to have one plane that I can use very effectively general purpose on the bench and very effective in the shooting board. I use my shooting board constantly. If you notice, put them side by side, you're going to see a lot more surface area on the side of the plane on the 5.5 compared to the low angle jack. Why is that important? Well, when you're using a shooting board, you need that plane to be very stable in that position. You don't want it easily tipping. You also want a lot of weight. When you're using a shooting board to plane the end grain of a piece of hardwood or even softwood, typically it's a difficult cut. So the fact that you have some weight behind that plane helps carry it through and makes it a much easier process. The low angle jack is not as stable because it does not have the same amount of surface area. Really not much of anywhere to hold on to it, and light. In fact, in terms of weight, this is just under 5 pounds. The original Bedrock was just over 5 pounds, and the Wood River version is actually just over 7 pounds. Well, that's a substantial difference. What else is different? Well, if you look at the way that you can open and close the throat, and if you're not familiar with that or don't know why, when you close the throat, in other words, that aperture where the shaving comes out, as you close that down, what it does is it helps prevent wood fiber from tearing directly ahead of the blade, particularly in figured wood. Now, it's very easy to do with this. You simply loosen this front knob. This lever, or lever, moves that toe plate, and you just get it where you want it, and then lock it in place. On a Bedrock-style plane, it's a little more complicated, but not a lot. There are 2 outside what are called frog retaining screws. You loosen those off just a 1/4 turn. The center screw moves the entire apparatus forward. You simply look down, and when you get it where you want it, you then lock it back in place and you go to work. So it's not a huge difference. One of the things I don't like about the low angle jack is it's very difficult to adjust the blade. So if you want to adjust the blade laterally on this plane, you've got to back off a little bit of the pressure off the lever cap, and then you've got to come in and tap one side or the other in order to get that lined up. On a traditional bench plane, you simply have a lateral adjustment lever and you move it to the right or to the left in order to skew the blade and get it parallel to the sole. Why do you want it parallel to the sole? 2 reasons. When you're planing a piece of wood like this, if the blade is not parallel to the sole, that means you're going to be taking an uneven amount off of one side compared to the other, and after multiple passes, you're no longer going to have a square edge. Over here, you want to have a perfectly square end on your board, and the shooting board is designed to hold the workpiece and the tool at right angles this way and at right angles this way. Sometimes you've got to go in and move that blade a little bit to fine-tune it and get it exactly where you want. What else? Well, the adjustment, the advance and retract mechanism is a little bit cumbersome. You've got to, now Wood River actually has done a nice job on this. They've added some little pieces along the outside of that knob, and it makes it a little easier to get a hold of. But here's the reason why I'm not a fan of it. If you look over here, This is a current project we're working on. This is out of cherry, and it's being finished directly from the hand plane. There will be no sanding in this. Everything comes right off of the hand plane. So let's say this is one of the components that I'm working on. Prior to final assembly, now remember the pieces have already been fit. I cannot afford to take much material off. I might need to get rid of pencil marks or fingerprints. So with my traditional bevel down plane, I'll get the blade parallel to the sole by sighting down there, and I see the blade right here as a thin black line. I use my lateral adjustment lever up against a light background to get that blade as close to parallel as I can tell by eye, and then I retract the blade fully, meaning I pull it all the way in. I'll use a little bit of wax on the sole to reduce the friction, and then as I start planing, while in the motion of planing, I can spin the adjuster knob and sneak up on it until that just starts to remove the slightest amount of material. I can also tell if the blade's a little bit to one side or the other. You'll notice the shaving's a little bit heavier on the right. So I'd come in here and I'd make a very slight adjustment and then continue planing. And I have tremendous control in being able to take a very, very light shaving. Now that's actually a little bit too heavy on the left. If I'm trying to do this with a low angle jack, to do that same feature, I have to stop, adjust, resume planing, adjust, and you just have a little more control over here because you're actually moving it or advancing the blade while you're moving the plane. I find that little bit of extra control makes a huge difference frequently. Weight, amount of surface area in the side, adjustment of the blade, lateral adjustment of the blade, all the reasons why I think this is a superior plane. Now the last thing we'll tackle is the very purpose around this plane is supposedly because it's a low angle, meaning the angle that your blade is meeting or planing the wood is lower than it would be on a standard bench plane. But I don't think that's so true. In fact, if you look at this, we'll take the lever cap off. Now this is a bevel up, so that main primary bevel is on the top as opposed to over here where it's on the bottom. So the bedding angle is 12 degrees. So if you take 12 degrees and add it to your primary bevel, which is 25, you're at 37 degrees. Now, if you're like me, or you're like most people, you're not going to want to polish all of that primary bevel every time you sharpen. Why polish back by my thumbnail in order to use way up here? So we employ what are called micro bevels, which means when you set it on the stone, you elevate it up off of the primary bevel so that you're only working the leading edge. I use 2 stones to sharpen with. I start with 1,000 grit, and on that stone, I prepare what I call a secondary bevel, which is typically about 3 or 4 degrees off of the primary. So you're somewhere around 29. And then I go to my fine stone, which is a Shapton 16,000, and I put what's called a third or a tertiary bevel, and I raise that one up an extra 1 or 2 degrees beyond the secondary. So if you do the math on that one, 12 and 25 is 37, and 4 on the 1,000 grit stone is 41, and 2 on the 16,000 grit stone is 43 degrees. Now over here, if you remove the lever cap, take the blade and chip breaker out, the blade is on the bottom side, so the only factoring you have to take into account in determining the angle of attack is what angle is the frog. The frog's 45 degrees. So there's a 2 degree difference. Do you think you're going to actually notice that? I highly doubt it. In fact, if you do the performance test, plane a piece of end grain with both and check it, there's no difference. I don't think anybody could actually determine the difference. And I'm all about performance. Number 1 is I want to have great results. Number 2, I want to be able to do it as fast as possible. And number 3 is the convenience factor. And I think that the traditional bevel down plane is the most convenient to use because of all of the features I talked to you about using it general purpose on the bench and using it on the shooting board, that extra mass, the stability, the wider footprint, 2 3/8 versus 2 inch. This one gets my vote every time. Of course, you can make up your own mind, but that's why I like the 5.5. Hope this was helpful.